The moment Gertrude Dawson walked through the double doors of the Dusty Creek Saloon on that scorching Tuesday morning in the summer of 1882, every man in the room went completely, utterly silent, the way a prairie goes quiet just before a tornado touches down. She had known they would stare. She had dressed for it, in a way, not in any manner designed to draw flattery, but in a manner designed to draw respect. Her riding skirt was dark brown wool, her blouse a crisp cream cotton button to the throat, and her hat was a proper wide-brimmed affair the color of charcoal that she had bought off a trail driver passing through Laramie 3 years ago. The hat sat on a crown of auburn hair that she kept pinned with ruthless efficiency. She was 31 years old, and she had the kind of face that had been pretty once and had, through weather and grief and stubbornness, become something considerably better than pretty. It had become handsome, formidable, real. She carried a leather satchel in her left hand and a bill of sale in her right, and she walked to the long table that had been set up along the back wall beneath a mounted longhorn skull and a hand-painted sign that read Wyoming Territorial Cattlemen's Association Quarterly Meeting, June 1882. There were 14 chairs around that table. 13 of them were already occupied by men who ranged in age from roughly 40 to roughly 70, who wore everything from trail-worn canvas to Sunday broadcloth, who held hats in their laps or coffee cups in their hands, and every single one of whom was now watching Gertrude Dawson with an expression that fell somewhere between stupefied and openly hostile. She pulled out the one empty chair, set her satchel on the table with a firm and deliberate thump, and sat down. "Good morning," she said. "I am Gertrude Dawson. I own the Broken G Ranch, formerly the property of my late husband Clarence Dawson, who passed of a fever this past February. The Broken G holds 1,400 acres in the Powder River Basin, runs approximately 600 head of cattle, and has been a dues-paying member of this association for the past 9 years. I am here to vote on the water rights resolution and to discuss the railroad spur proposal, same as the rest of you." The silence stretched on for another few seconds. Then, from the far end of the table, a heavy-set man with a red beard and a face like a boiled ham cleared his throat loudly. His name was Vernon Aldrich, and he owned the largest spread in the county, and he looked at Gertrude the way a man looks at something he has accidentally stepped in. "Now, see here," Vernon Aldrich began. "I have the deed," Gertrude said pleasantly and slid it across the table, "and the membership certificate, and a letter from the association secretary, that is Mr. Holloway, yes, who is sitting right there, and who I believe signed this himself not 3 weeks ago, confirming that my dues are current and my membership is valid." Mr. Holloway, a thin, nervous man with spectacles, looked as though he very much wished he were somewhere else. He was indeed sitting at the table, and the letter was indeed in his handwriting. He adjusted his spectacles and said nothing. "This is irregular," said another man, this one lean and angular with a silver mustache that curled at the ends. His name was posted on a small wooden placard in front of him, Thatcher. She had not yet looked at him directly, but she felt his eyes on her the way you feel the first warning touch of a cold front, something changing in the air. "It is not irregular," Gertrude replied. "It is merely unusual. Those are not the same thing. The bylaws of this association state that membership belongs to the registered deed holder of any qualifying ranch within the territorial boundaries. My name is now on that deed, therefore I am the member. I looked it up." She finally turned and looked at the man named Thatcher. He was not what she had expected. She had anticipated someone like Vernon Aldrich, large, loud, self-satisfied. Instead, the man sitting 2 seats to her left was perhaps 35, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples and a jaw that looked as though it had been carved with some care, and then left out in the sun for several years. His eyes were an unusual shade, somewhere between gray and green, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not hostility. It was not amusement, exactly. It was something more careful than either of those things, something that looked almost like assessment. Tobias Thatcher, he said, and tipped his head in a slight acknowledgement. Thatcher Creek Ranch. North of you, I believe, if you are the broken G, 10 miles, she said. Yes. I am not objecting to your presence, he said, and there was something in his voice, a quietness that was not softness, the way still water is not the same as shallow water, that made Vernon Aldrich turn and look at him with something like surprise. I was merely noting the irregularity for the record. But you have already addressed that. I have, she said. He nodded, and to her considerable astonishment that appeared to be that, at least on his part, Vernon Aldrich was not nearly so easily satisfied. The meeting went on for 3 hours. It was, in many ways, the most exhausting 3 hours of Gertrude Dawson's life, and she had once spent 14 hours in a saddle during a late-season blizzard trying to push strays back toward the home pasture. Vernon Aldrich questioned everything she said. He questioned her numbers, her memory, her understanding of water rights law, her right to speak on behalf of her ranch hands, and at one point, with a condescension so thick you could have spread it on bread, her ability to understand the implications of the railroad spur proposal at all. She answered every objection with precise, documented calm. She had spent 3 weeks preparing for this meeting. She had read everything she could find about the proposed water rights resolution, about the Northern Pacific's expansion plans, about comparable agreements made by associations in Montana and Colorado. She had written letters to a lawyer in Cheyenne. She had done her work, and she knew her work, and she was not going to let Vernon Aldrich's red face and large voice convince her otherwise. What surprised her, what she would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward, the way you turn a smooth stone in your pocket without quite realizing you are doing it, was the way Tobias Thatcher kept quietly, consistently, almost imperceptibly supporting her throughout the morning, not in any showy way. He did not ride to her defense or make speeches. But when Vernon Aldrich challenged her water rights figures, it was Thatcher who said, without looking up from his own notes, "Her numbers match the survey I commissioned last spring, Vernon, to the acre." When the question of the railroad spur came up and Aldrich began talking over her, it was Thatcher who said, evenly and without heat, "Let her finish." And when the vote on the water rights resolution finally came, the vote that Gertrude had driven 40 miles through summer heat and the skepticism of 11 ranch hands to cast, the tally was 9-5 in favor, and Tobias Thatcher's hand went up without hesitation on the same side as hers. She left with exactly what she had come for. The water rights resolution passed. The terms of the railroad spur agreement were referred to a subcommittee. Her presence at future meetings was, if not warmly welcomed, at least formally acknowledged as legitimate. Vernon Aldrich left the meeting looking like a man who had swallowed something disagreeable and could not figure out where to spit it. Gertrude was standing at the hitching post outside the saloon, checking the cinch on her horse, a big, steady roan mare named Patience, when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. "Miss Dawson," she turned. Tobias Thatcher was standing a few feet away, holding his hat in one hand and squinting slightly in the midday glare. Up close she could see that his face had a few old lines in it, not many, but the kind that come from squinting at distance and from weather, not from idleness. His shirt was a faded blue that had been washed many times. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow. "Mrs. Dawson," she said, "though I do not insist on it." "Mrs. Dawson," he corrected himself without embarrassment. "I wanted to say what you did in there took considerable nerve." Vernon Aldrich has run roughshod over this association for 7 years. It was something to watch someone hold their ground against him. She regarded him for a moment. "You helped," she said. He looked slightly startled. "I just stated facts." "Stating facts at the right moment is helping," she said. "I know the difference." She turned back to the horse, checked the saddlebag buckle. "Why did you? I'm trying to understand your motivation. You did not know me. You had no reason to support someone the other men were actively trying to dismiss." The silence lasted long enough that she turned back to look at him. He was looking at her steadily, his hat now in both hands. "Honestly," he said, "please." "Because you were right," he said. And because right is right regardless of who is saying it. And because he stopped, and something shifted briefly in his expression, something she did not have a name for yet. Because my own mother ran our family's ranch for 6 years after my father died, and I watched men treat her the way they were treating you today, and I did not enjoy it any more today than I did then. Gertrude looked at him. She felt something shift inside her chest, not dramatically, not like something breaking or igniting, but like a door she had not realized was closed, swinging open by an inch, just enough to let in a slant of different light. "I am sorry about your mother," she said. "She managed," he said. "She always managed." He paused. "Are you riding back to the Broken G today?" "I am. I want to be home before dark. The road through Sutter's Pass can be rough this time of year. Flash floods have taken out part of the trail near Miller Creek." He said it matter-of-factly, without the particular flavor of concern that would have implied she needed his protection. He said it the way one rancher tells another about trail conditions. "You might want to come around through the eastern cutoff. Adds about 4 miles, but it keeps you on solid ground." She thought about it. She had not known about the flooding. "I appreciate that," she said. He nodded, settled his hat back on his head. "If you have questions about the subcommittee process, the railroad business, I am not difficult to find. Thatcher Creek is due north on the main road. I have a good survey map of the basin that might be useful when they reconvene." "I may take you up on that," she said. "I hope you will," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it feel like more than a practical offer, though he kept his face so carefully neutral that she could not be sure. She rode home through the eastern cutoff, adding the extra 4 miles without complaint, watching the late afternoon light turn the sage country to copper and gold. She thought about the meeting. She thought about Vernon Aldrich's face when the vote went against him. She thought about the deed in her satchel and the water rights, and about Clarence, about the 3 good years and the 2 difficult ones and the months of nursing and loss, and then the strange, terrifying liberty of widowhood, which was not liberty at all when you had to fight for every inch of it. She thought about Tobias Thatcher's eyes, and the way he had said, "I hope you will." She told herself it was nothing. She had no time for nothing to become something. She was wrong about that, as it turned out. The subcommittee met for the first time 3 weeks later, at the ranch of a man named Brewster who lived halfway between Dusty Creek and the Thatcher spread. There were 5 members: Gertrude Thatcher, a quiet Norwegian man named Bjornson who ran sheep and said very little but had surprisingly shrewd opinions on easement law, and 2 others of limited consequence. Vernon Aldrich was not on the subcommittee because Gertrude had very deliberately gotten her vote in before his. That had been intentional. She arrived at the Brewster ranch to find Thatcher already there, standing in the yard and talking to Brewster's foreman about the condition of a fence line. He saw her ride in and excused himself from the conversation. He came across the yard with the particular walk of a man who has covered a great deal of ground on foot and on horseback and no longer wastes any motion doing either. "You came around through the pass this time," he observed, looking at her horse's legs. There was a faint dusting of red clay on Patience's lower legs that would only have come from the western road. "The eastern route is 4 miles longer," she said. "I confirmed that the pass flooding has receded." "It has," he agreed. "Mostly." He took Patience's reins while she dismounted, which she noticed but did not comment on. "I brought that survey map I mentioned." "Good," she said. "I brought the letter from the Cheyenne lawyer about the easement terms." He glanced at her with something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Of course you did." The subcommittee meeting lasted most of the afternoon. They worked through the railroad company's proposed terms section by section, and Gertrude discovered that Thatcher had a mind that worked in a way complementary to her own. Where she built arguments carefully from documented evidence outward, he had an instinct for the practical implications, for what something would actually mean on the ground, in the dirt, across a fence line. They disagreed twice, both times about matters of timing rather than substance, and both times they talked it through until something better than either original position emerged. Bjornson watched all of this with the expression of a man watching two chess players and waiting to see who would run out of moves first. By the time the meeting ended and Brewster's wife had brought coffee and cold cornbread, and the subcommittee had produced 2 pages of counterproposal for the railroad's legal team, it was pushing 5 o'clock, and the shadows had gone long and blue across the yard. Thatcher walked her to where Patience was tied. "I did not realize," he said as she checked her cinch again out of habit, "that Clarence Dawson had married someone with a legal mind." "Clarence did not know it either," she said. "I was not given much occasion to use it while he was alive." She kept her voice even when she said it. It was a true thing to say, and she was past the age of prettying up true things. He was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," he said. "Do not be sorry for him," she said. "He was a decent man. He had certain ideas about what a wife does and does not concern herself with." She finally looked up at him. "He would have been horrified by me walking into that meeting." "He would have been wrong," Thatcher said with a directness that startled her. She looked at him for another moment. The evening light was catching the silver in his hair, and there was something in his expression that was wholly unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. He looked for just a moment as though he had said more than he had strictly intended to say. "Yes," she said softly, "he would have been." She rode home with the taste of that conversation in her mouth like the first good rain after a drought, something so long absent that, when it finally arrived, it took a moment to recognize it for what it was. The following month brought the kind of trouble that the Western Territories specialized in producing without warning. The Broken G's water situation, which the resolution was supposed to address, became critical ahead of schedule when the creek that ran through the North Pasture dropped to a trickle 6 weeks earlier than any previous summer. Gertrude's foreman, a steady Texan named Holt who had been with the Broken G since before she arrived, came to her with the numbers, and they were not comfortable numbers. They had enough water at the main pond to sustain the herd for perhaps 3 weeks. After that, they would need to either move cattle or find another source. She was riding the fence line of the North Pasture, trying to calculate how quickly she could move 300 head to the southern grazing without breaking the fence maintenance schedule, when she heard a horse coming up fast behind her. She turned, hand going instinctively to the Winchester in her saddle scabbard, then relaxed when she recognized the horse, a big black gelding she had seen tied outside the Brewster ranch. Tobias Thatcher pulled up beside her in a cloud of dust and tipped his hat. "I was coming to find you," he said. She felt something she firmly classified as only mild interest move through her chest. "Why?" "Because I have a creek," he said. "Thatcher Creek, actually, which runs year-round because it comes off the northern ridge where the snowmelt runs later. It passes within a mile of your northern property line." He paused. "I am proposing a temporary water-sharing agreement, formal and documented, until the seasonal drought breaks and your creek recovers." She stared at him. "You are offering me water." "I am offering a mutual arrangement," he said carefully. "I have excess water. You have excess grass on your southern acres, which I noted because I can see it from my eastern fence. My cattle are running the North Pasture thin. If you will allow me to rotate 30 head through your southern grazing for 6 weeks, I will open the creek access for your herd." It was a fair arrangement, a genuinely fair arrangement, structured so that neither party was receiving charity. She had not asked for it. He had ridden 10 miles to offer it without being asked. "That is," she said slowly, "a very practical proposal." "I am a practical person," he said. "Most practical people wait to be asked," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I was in the area," he said, which was so obviously not entirely true that she almost laughed. She did not laugh. She looked at the dry, cracked earth of the creek bed and thought about her cattle and thought about practicality and thought about a man who rode 10 miles for reasons he was packaging as something other than what they were. "Draw up the agreement," she said. "I will have Holt look at it, and if the terms are as you have described, I will sign it." "I can bring it tomorrow," he said, "if that suits." "That suits," she said. He nodded, turned his horse. Then he stopped and turned back, and there was a brief pause in which she had the distinct impression he was deciding whether or not to say something. "How are you managing?" he asked, not the polite, empty version of that question. The real version. She considered brushing it off. It was her instinct to do so. She had been brushing off intrusion into her inner life for most of her adult life, first as a daughter, then as a wife, and now as a widow with a failing ranch trying to prove something to a county full of men who thought she could not. But there was something in the directness of his gray-green eyes that made the deflection feel dishonest in a way she was not comfortable with. "I am managing," she said. "Some days are harder than others, but I have not failed yet, and I do not intend to begin." "I know you do not," he said, and rode away. He brought the agreement the next morning. It was exactly as he had described, fairly worded and clearly drawn. Holt looked it over, grunted in a way that meant approval, and Gertrude signed it. She offered Thatcher coffee, which he accepted, and they sat at her kitchen table and drank it and talked about the subcommittee's progress and the railroad's response to the counterproposal and the likelihood of fall bringing early snow to the upper grazing. It was a perfectly ordinary conversation. It was also, she realized, the best conversation she had had in several years, possibly in longer than that. Clarence had been a decent man but not a talkative one, and his idea of a good evening was silence and a pipe, which was fine, which was peaceful, but which had left her, over 8 years of marriage, enormously hungry for the particular pleasure of being genuinely listened to by someone who was genuinely interested in what she was saying. Thatcher listened the way very few people listen. He was not waiting for a gap in her words to insert his own. He was actually following the thread of her thoughts, and when he responded, he was responding to what she had actually said, not to what he had expected her to say. When he finished his coffee and stood to leave, he picked up his hat from the table and stood holding it in the same two-handed way she had noticed before, and she thought, "That is a man who is thinking about something he is not saying." "Same time next week for the fence rotation?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Holt will be at the northern gate." "Good." He put his hat on, looked at her. "Mrs. Dawson, Gertrude," she said, and surprised herself. He looked equally surprised in a contained, interior way. "Tobias," he said after a moment, "if you are willing." "I am," she said. He left. She stood in the doorway and watched the black gelding carry him back down the road toward the north, and she stood there considerably longer than was strictly necessary for watching a departing horse. Summer deepened, and the water-sharing arrangement worked exactly as designed. The creek held, her cattle stayed watered, his 30 head put good weight on from her southern grass. The subcommittee met twice more, and the railroad negotiation moved forward with their counterproposal largely intact, which was a small miracle, and one that Gertrude intended to credit to the Cheyenne lawyer's careful wording. The quarterly association meeting came around again, and she walked through the double doors of the Dusty Creek Saloon and took her seat with considerably less ceremony than the first time, because the second time there was no silence. There was a general shuffling of acknowledgement, a few nods, and Vernon Aldrich looked at his coffee cup with the air of a man who has decided that a thing he dislikes is nonetheless not going to go away. Tobias was already seated. When she came in, he looked up from his papers and their eyes met, and she felt it again, that opening of a door by an inch, and then perhaps by 2 inches, and then it became difficult to think of it as only an inch at all. The meeting proceeded. The railroad spur agreement was formally adopted. The association voted to send a formal letter of complaint to the territorial governor regarding land grabbing by an eastern cattle syndicate that had been buying up adjacent homesteads and squeezing small ranchers on the Platte. Gertrude had done her research on this too and made 3 points during the discussion that changed the specific wording of the letter, making it considerably more legally precise and therefore more likely to actually accomplish something. When the meeting ended, Vernon Aldrich stopped her in the doorway. He was a big man, and he used his size the way some men do, not quite threatening, but positioned to remind you of the option. He looked down at her with his boiled ham face and said, I suppose you will be attending every one of these now. Every one, she confirmed pleasantly. He leaned slightly closer. Running a ranch alone is not a woman's work, he said. It will go bad on you before winter, and when it does, you will need to sell, and I want you to know that I will make you a fair offer. It was meant to unsettle her. It was meant to plant a seed of doubt that would grow in the dark of the next hard night. Mr. Aldrich, she said, I have been hearing variations of what you just said since I was 17 years old and told my father I intended to study land law. Every single time I have proven the opinion incorrect. I expect to continue the tradition. She smiled at him, and it was a genuine smile which somehow made it worse for him. Enjoy the rest of your day. She walked out into the sunshine and found Tobias Thatcher leaning against the hitching post with his arms folded, looking at the middle distance. He turned when she came out. Aldrich, he said. He offered to buy me out when I fail, she said. He has said that to me twice, Thatcher said. He told me the drought 2 years ago would ruin me. A pause. I am still here. So you are, she said. He pushed off the post and they walked together to where their horses were tied, and it was only when she was checking Patience's cinch that she realized they had naturally fallen into step with each other the way people do when they are accustomed to each other's company. I am riding out to the northern fence line this afternoon, he said. There is something I want to show you if you have the time. It has to do with the creek and the proposed boundary agreement with the railroad. It would be easier to show you on the ground than to describe it. She looked at him. The afternoon was wide and golden, and she had not been anywhere purely for the pleasure of going anywhere in a very long time. I have the time, she said. They rode north out of Dusty Creek together, side by side on the road that curved through the sage flats and then climbed toward the higher ground where the Thatcher Creek Ranch began. He did not rush her, and she did not lag behind, and they kept an easy pace that let the horses stretch without strain. He told her about his family's ranch, how his father had come out from Ohio in the 1860s with $40 and a mule and a tremendous capacity for work, and had built something from nothing, the way people did in that time and place. How his mother, whose name was Esther, had kept it going after typhoid took his father when Tobias was 19, and how the 6 years of Esther Thatcher running the ranch alone had made Tobias into the kind of man who found it not just acceptable but natural for a woman to sit at a rancher's meeting and know more about water rights law than the men who had been arguing about it for years. Where is she now? Gertrude asked. Passed 3 years ago, he said. His voice did not break, but there was a texture in it, something carefully managed. Heart, she was 64. She got to see the ranch turn into something she would have been proud of, which I am glad about. I am sorry, she said. She would have liked you, he said, and then appeared to realize what he had said and looked straight ahead at the road. She had a low tolerance for pretense. She would have appreciated your directness. Gertrude did not examine this statement as carefully as she might have. She was busy noticing the country around her, the way the sage gave way to grass as they climbed, the way the air changed at elevation, carrying a faint mineral coolness from the snowmelt above. The Thatcher property came into view gradually. A solid, well-maintained ranch house in a valley between 2 ridges, a large red barn, several smaller outbuildings, and the glint of water in the middle distance. There, he said, pointing. That is the creek at full summer flow. It is lower than usual but still running strong. She could see it, a bright thread winding through the bottomland. And she could see what he wanted her to see, the way the creek's natural course would intersect with the railroad's proposed right-of-way at 2 points, which had implications for both the water rights and the easement terms they were still negotiating. They want to bridge it here, he said, riding to the edge of his property where it backed against a low ridge. But if they build the bridge here, it affects the natural drainage for my north pasture and for your northern access. We should push for a bridge placement another quarter-mile east. She studied the terrain. He was right. She pulled out the folded survey map she had brought from the previous meeting and traced the line with her finger, and he leaned in from the saddle to look at the same map, and they were suddenly very close together in a way that happened entirely practically and had nothing theatrical about it, which somehow made it more significant rather than less. "Quarter-mile east," she said. "Yes, that makes sense." "I will draft the amendment," he said. "I will have the Cheyenne lawyer review it before we submit," she said. "Good," he said. They looked at each other from a foot apart, both holding the edges of the same map. She was not a person who experienced things dramatically. She had long since noticed that dramatic experiences tend to be ones that wash over you and leave marks, while the things that actually change you happen quietly, incrementally, in moments that only reveal their significance in retrospect. She had a feeling, standing there at the edge of Tobias Thatcher's property with the creek glinting in the afternoon sun and his hand near hers on the edge of a survey map, that this was one of those moments. She straightened up. He straightened up. They rode back toward Dusty Creek in the late afternoon gold, and by the time they separated at the crossroads where his road went north and hers went south, she was aware that something had shifted in her understanding of her own situation, of what her life was going to be, of what she was willing to let it contain. She had not come to Wyoming looking for this. She had come to Wyoming at 22 as Clarence Dawson's wife, and she had made a life here, and she had lost him here, and she had decided to stay and fight for what she had built even when staying and fighting was the harder choice. She had not built room in that fight for anything as inconvenient as this. And yet, August brought both heat and complications. A man named Harlan Rook, who worked as a foreman for the Eastern Syndicate that had been buying up homesteads, rode onto the Broken G one afternoon with two other men, and a document he claimed gave the syndicate prior rights to the northern water access. It was the kind of document that looks impressive if you have not spent 3 weeks reading water rights law with a lawyer in Cheyenne. And it was, upon examination, constructed of approximately 40% legal terminology and 60% invention. Gertrude read it twice, standing on her own porch with Harlan Rook watching her and his two men sitting their horses in her yard, with expressions designed to communicate the availability of alternative methods of persuasion. She folded the document and handed it back to him. "This claim is not valid," she said. "The mineral rights survey it references was conducted under a statute that was superseded by territorial law in 1879. The prior rights claim requires a continuous use period that your syndicate cannot document because they did not own adjacent land until last year, and the easement it claims was never recorded with the Territorial Land Office." She looked at Harlan Rook's flat, sun-weathered face without expression. "Tell whoever sent you that I am aware of the relevant law and that I am not easy to intimidate. If your employers wish to pursue a legitimate claim, they may contact my attorney in Cheyenne." Rook stared at her for a long moment. He was a big man with a hard face and the particular combination of attributes that men who do intimidation for a living tend to accumulate. "Ma'am," he said in a tone that was not polite, "you are a woman alone on a ranch. That is a difficult situation." "I am a ranch owner with 23 employees and a clear deed," she said. "That is a legal situation. You may go now." He went. She stood on the porch and watched him go and then walked inside and sat down at the kitchen table and was completely still for about 2 minutes because her hands were shaking and she needed them to stop before Holt or any of the hands saw them. She wrote a letter to the Cheyenne lawyer that evening. She also wrote a note to Tobias Thatcher, informing him of the visit, because if the syndicate was moving on the Broken G's water access, they would likely move on Thatcher Creek too, and he deserved to know. He appeared at her gate the morning after the note arrived. He tied his horse and came to the door, and she brought him in and showed him the copy she had made of the syndicate's document. He read it standing at the kitchen table, and as he read, she watched something in his face go very still and very focused in a way that she found, against all practical judgment, deeply reassuring. "This is a fraud," he said flatly. "Yes," she said, Have you contacted Holloway as association secretary? He needs to know the syndicate is moving on water rights. I wrote to him last night, she said, and to the lawyer. He looked up from the document. Are you all right? It was such a direct question that it caught her off guard. I handled it, she said. I know you handled it, he said. I asked if you are all right. She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet around them, and through the window the morning was coming in bright and clean, and Gertrude Dawson, who had not cried in front of another human being since she was 24 years old, felt something press dangerously at the back of her throat. Rook's men had rifles, she said. They did not do anything with them, but they had them, and they wanted me to know they had them, and there was a moment when she stopped. I was not certain the documentation argument was going to be sufficient, she said carefully. Tobias Thatcher set down the document. He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a man making a conscious decision, he said, I would like to ride over here every few days for the next few weeks. Not to manage your situation, you are entirely capable of managing it, but because I would feel considerably better knowing I was close enough to be useful if it became necessary. And because, he paused and looked at his hat on the table and then looked back at her. Because I am here, Gertrude, if you need someone to be here. She looked at him for a long time. I am not accustomed to needing help, she said. I am aware, he said. I am not offering because I think you cannot manage without it. I am offering because it should not have to be this hard, and because, he stopped again, more completely this time, and there was a kind of careful precision about the pause that told her he was being very deliberate about what he said next. Because I find that I am not as indifferent to what happens to you as I perhaps should be, given that we have only been acquainted 4 months. The kitchen was very quiet. 4 months is not very long, she said carefully. No, he agreed. It is not. But it can be enough time, she said slowly, to understand what kind of person someone is, if you are paying attention. It can, he said. What kind of person do you think I am? She asked. It was not a vain question. It was the kind of question that wants a true answer. He considered it. The kind who does what needs doing without waiting for someone to tell her it is permissible, he said. The kind who does her homework and keeps her word and does not give up what she has earned. The kind who, another pause, and this one felt different, less careful, more honest. The kind who makes a room feel more honest just by walking into it. Gertrude Dawson had managed ranches and lawyers and intimidating men with rifles. She had held her husband's hand while he died and then gotten up the next morning and kept the ranch running because what else was there to do? She had walked into that meeting and taken her seat and cast her vote and left with what she came for. She was not a woman who was easily undone. And yet something in those words undid her, just a little, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way that matters, in the interior place where things actually happen. You may ride over, she said. Her voice was entirely steady. On the practical grounds you described. He nodded. Something in his eyes said he understood exactly what she meant, and what she did not yet say, and was entirely willing to let her take the time she needed. He did ride over. Every few days, as promised. Sometimes they had a practical reason, the subcommittee's ongoing work, the syndicate threat, the condition of the shared fence line. Sometimes the practical reason was thin enough to be nearly transparent, and they both knew it and neither of them remarked on it. He helped Holt and 2 of the hands rebuild a section of the north fence that had been damaged by early-season lightning, not because he was asked, but because he was there and the work needed doing, and he knew how to do it. She rode out to Thatcher Creek one afternoon to look at a water diversion project he was planning, and ended up spending 3 hours in practical conversation that somehow also encompassed her childhood in Illinois and his time as a young man working cattle drives on the Kishom Trail at 18, which was where he had learned that country was both beautiful and merciless, and that the only way to survive in it was to be honest with yourself about what you could and could not control. What can you not control? She asked. They were sitting on a log by the creek, which was the kind of thing that happens when 2 people who have been talking for 3 hours do not want to get back on their horses yet. He was quiet for a moment. Most things, he said. Weather, other people's choices, time. He looked at the water. The way certain things become clear to you when it is inconvenient for them to do so. She looked at him sidelong. Such as, he turned and looked at her directly. The afternoon light was coming through the cottonwoods along the creek bank, making shifting patterns across everything, and he looked at her with those careful gray-green eyes that she had been thinking about. She now admitted to herself, with embarrassing frequency. Such as the fact, he said, slowly and very clearly, that I have been finding excuses to ride to the Broken G every 3 days for 2 months, and that I am not actually as interested in the fence line as I have been implying. She said nothing for a moment. The creek ran on, indifferent and practical. Tobias, she said. I know, he said. You are not, he stopped. I am not asking for anything. I understand that you are. I am lonely, she said, and it came out more plainly than she had intended it, and having come out that plainly there was no point in walking it back. I have been lonely for a very long time, years, before Clarence died, if I am being completely honest, which apparently I am. She looked at the water. I did not expect to find, I do not know what word to use. Neither do I, he said quietly. Kinship, she said at last. I did not expect to find it here. In this, she gestured vaguely, in this particular situation, with this particular improbable circumstance of a rancher's meeting and water rights law. He was quiet for a long time. The cottonwood leaves moved. The creek ran. I have been alone since my mother died, he said. Before that, really, I was managing the ranch. There was not much room for he paused. I had given up on the idea of finding someone who could, another pause longer, who could simply sit by this creek and talk to me like this. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her. And there was nothing performed or careful about either of them in that moment. Just two people sitting by a creek in the Wyoming afternoon, having arrived, by the strangest and most unlikely road, at the same place. I should tell you, she said, that I am not simple. I have strong opinions, and I intend to keep running my ranch and attending every association meeting, and I will not be managed. I am aware of all of that, he said. I have been aware of it since you walked into the Dusty Creek saloon and told Vernon Aldrich his bylaws argument was invalid. And you do not find it. I find it, he said, the most remarkable thing I have seen in a very long time. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the moment stretched, warm and certain, until she leaned forward and kissed him quickly, once, more definite than exploratory, because she was Gertrude Dawson, and she had never in her life waited for someone else to do the thing that needed doing. He went very still for exactly 1 breath. Then he kissed her back, and it was not quick, and it was not exploratory either. It was the kiss of someone who has thought about something a great deal and is now discovering that the reality is better than the thought, which is one of the rarer experiences available to human beings. When they separated, she was aware of her own heartbeat in an unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable way. Well, she said. Yes, he said, which covered it. The following weeks did not become simple, because nothing in the Powder River Basin in the summer of 1882 was simple. The syndicate made another move, this time attempting to file a competing deed claim on a strip of land along the Broken G's northern boundary, and this required Gertrude to ride to Cheyenne to meet with the lawyer in person, which took 4 days and cost considerably more than she had budgeted. She went because there was no other option, and she prevailed because she had the correct documentation and a clear title chain, and the kind of stubborn, precise argumentation that frontier legal disputes tended to reward when properly assembled. She came back from Cheyenne to find that Tobias had been checking in at the Broken G in her absence, not managing things, as Holt made very clear, but checking in, making himself available, making sure nothing had gone wrong with the cattle on the shared grazing arrangement. Holt told her this in the particular tone a foreman uses when he approves of something, but does not intend to say so directly. He brought his 2 best hands to help finish the new water trough, Holt said, looking at a point somewhere above her left shoulder. Mentioned he had spare lumber. "Did he?" she said. "It is a good trough," Holt said and walked away. She went and looked at the trough, which was indeed well built, and then she rode north to the Thatcher place and found Tobias in the barn rewiring a fence section. He looked up when she came in. "Cheyenne," he said. "Successful," she said. "The competing deed claim has been filed with prejudice, and the syndicate has been informed that further fraudulent filings will result in criminal referral to the territorial marshal." "Good," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for checking in on the ranch." "Holt runs that ranch," he said. "He does not need my help, but he seemed glad you were there," she said. "I know. Holt is not accustomed to having anyone to consult with who is not me." He set down the wire tool. He crossed the barn and stood in front of her and looked at her the same way he had been looking at her for 3 months, but now it was without any particular attempt at management or constraint. "I missed you," he said. 4 days as he stopped. "It is a significant amount of time to miss someone you have only known since June." "It is September," she said. "We have known each other 3 months." "Yes," he said. 3 months is not very long," she said. Which was what she had said before, by the creek, before she kissed him. "We have covered considerable ground in 3 months," he said, which was entirely true. She reached up and touched the small scar above his left eyebrow, the one she had noticed on the first day, without particularly planning to do so. "How did you get this?" she asked. "A fence wire," he said. 17 years old, not paying attention, which is the most common cause of fence injuries. His voice had gone quieter. Her hand was still near his face. "Tobias," she said. "Gertrude," he said. "I would like to continue this," she said. "Whatever this is, I would like to see what it becomes." "So would I," he said, "very much." "I am still not simple," she said. "I am counting on it," he said. And smiled, which was a rare enough event on his particular face that when it happened it was worth noting. It changed everything. It made him look younger and warmer and entirely, dangerously human. She kissed him again, and this time neither of them were rushing, and neither of them pretended it was anything less than what it was. Autumn came in off the high country like a beautiful argument, all gold and red, and the smell of cold coming down from the peaks. The water-sharing arrangement wound down as Gertrude's Creek recovered with the seasonal rains, and the formal agreement was closed out with a document that both parties signed, and that was filed with the association for the record. The railroad spur agreement was finalized in October, with the bridge placement exactly where Tobias had proposed, a quarter-mile east of the original plan, which meant both their properties were protected. The Eastern Syndicate, bloodied by the Cheyenne legal battle and apparently finding better targets elsewhere, retreated from the Powder River Basin before the first snow. Vernon Aldrich continued to be Vernon Aldrich at association meetings, but something had shifted in the dynamic of those gatherings. Not dramatically, but in the subtle, structural way that things shift when a situation that everyone assumed was permanent turns out to be negotiable. Gertrude sat at that table every quarter, and after a while she sat there the way she sat at her own kitchen table, like someone who belonged there because she did. She and Tobias saw each other regularly through the fall, once or twice a week, sometimes more, the practical excuses giving way entirely as the weather closed in, and the seasons required cooperation between neighboring ranches in the way that the West enforced community between people who might otherwise have maintained comfortable isolation. They rode fence lines and sat by fires and ate meals that one or the other had cooked and talked endlessly, the way two people talk when they have been waiting a long time for someone who talks back. He was not, she discovered, uniformly easy. He had a stubborn streak that matched her own and a tendency to go very quiet when he was troubled, which she found less difficult to read than he perhaps intended, and opinions about certain subjects that she disagreed with strongly and told him so without softening it, and he told her she was wrong, and they argued, and sometimes she was right, and sometimes he was right, and once or twice they arrived at a conclusion that neither of them had started with, which she found was the best kind of argument. He discovered that she could not cook biscuits to save her life, which she freely admitted because biscuits were not worth defending, and that she had a habit of reading legal documents in bed by lamplight until 2 in the morning, and that when she laughed, which was not frequent enough, in his opinion, so he worked at it. It was sudden and real and entirely changed her face. She discovered that he could not carry a tune in a bucket and sang anyway when he thought no one was listening, and that he had strong opinions about the proper way to shoe a horse and was almost certainly correct about them, and that he kept a small, battered collection of poetry on the shelf in his study, Tennyson and Whitman, and a broken-backed copy of Keats, which he would have died before admitting to anyone he had not known very well for at least 6 months. She had known him long enough by the time she found the books to pick up the Keats, read a line aloud, and watch his face do something complicated. "Do not make anything of that," he said. "I would not dream of it," she said, and put the book back with great care. November brought the first hard snow, and the ranch work shifted into the particular gear of winter management, feed calculations, and shelter checks, and the cold arithmetic of keeping animals alive when the temperature dropped and stayed there. Gertrude had done 4 Wyoming winters, so she knew what was coming, and she had prepared with characteristic thoroughness. The hay stores were high, the outbuildings were caulked, the water supply to the cattle yards had been protected against freeze. She was in the barn on a Sunday morning, working through a hay inventory with Holt, when Tobias rode in from the north in a coat that was already white with blown snow. He dismounted and handed his horse to one of the hands and came into the barn, pulling off his gloves. His face was red with cold, and his expression was the concentrated one she had learned to associate with something on his mind that he had been working up to. She looked at Holt. Holt looked at the hay bales and found something tremendously interesting about them. "Tobias," she said, "what is it?" He looked at her for a moment. "Will you walk outside with me?" It was 11 degrees and snowing. She put on her coat and went outside with him anyway. They stood just outside the barn door out of the wind, and he turned to face her and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had come to know as well as she knew the outline of her own ridge against the morning sky. "I have been thinking," he said, "about next year." "What about next year?" "About whether," he started again. "The water agreement worked. The subcommittee work is ongoing. The ranches cooperate in a way that is mutually beneficial." He was doing the thing where he approached something sideways, which she had learned to let run its course, because he always arrived, eventually, at the actual thing. "All true," she said. "It occurs to me," he said slowly, "that the cooperation between the Broken G and Thatcher Creek could be more formal, more permanent." He looked at her. "I am not making this argument particularly well." "You are making it clearly enough," she said. She could feel her heart doing the strange, inconvenient thing it had been doing since June. "But I would like you to finish it." He looked at her in the blowing snow with complete, unguarded steadiness. "I love you, Gertrude," he said. "I have known it for some time, and I have been deciding how to say it properly, and I have concluded that there is no properly, so I will simply say it. I love you. And I would like, if you will have me, I would like very much to marry you." The snow came down around them, soft and silent and completely indifferent to the magnitude of what was happening under it. Gertrude Dawson had been 31 when she walked into that ranchers' meeting. She was 32 now in November, with snow on her coat and cold on her face, and a man she loved looking at her from 2 feet away with everything he felt laid entirely open. She was not someone who wept, but she felt the pressure of something very large and very warm moving through her chest. "I will have you," she said, "on conditions." "Name them," he said immediately, which was the only correct answer. "The Broken G keeps its name," she said. "It is mine and I built it and it keeps its name." "Yes," he said. "I keep attending the association meetings and conducting association business as a full member in my own right." "Obviously," he said, and something in his tone suggested that he would have been alarmed if she had suggested otherwise. "And I will need some time," she said, "to discuss the practical arrangements with Holt and the hands before any formal changes are made to the management structure." The ranch is their livelihood and they deserve proper notice and input. Of course, he said. Those are my conditions, she said. Accepted, he said. All of them, without modification. He looked at her. Do you have anything else? She stepped forward and closed the 2 feet between them and looked up at him. Yes, she said. I love you too, since you were apparently waiting for me to say it. He put his hands on either side of her face with enormous, careful gentleness and kissed her in the falling snow, and she kissed him back in the falling snow, and Holt, who had been watching from the barn door, turned back to the hay bales with an expression that was, on him, practically effusive. They were married in March of 1883, when the worst of the winter had broken and the roads were passable again, in a ceremony at the church in Dusty Creek that was attended by most of the Powder River Basin's ranching community, because news traveled fast in Wyoming, and because people who had witnessed the June meeting, by which time the story had become something of local legend, had been speculating about this outcome for months. Gertrude wore her best dress, which was a deep green that suited her auburn hair, and flowers that the minister's wife had coaxed out of a greenhouse that existed primarily for the purpose of giving Wyoming brides something to carry in March. Tobias wore the only suit he owned, which fit him well enough and which he had brushed with considerable care. Vernon Aldrich did not attend, but he sent a note, which Gertrude framed and kept because it was so thoroughly graceless that it was almost charming. Bjornson, the sheep rancher, attended and brought a gift of excellent smoked lamb and a handshake that nearly broke Tobias's fingers, which was his version of emotional expression. The Cheyenne lawyer sent a very proper letter of congratulations and a small gift of a bound Wyoming territorial law volume that Gertrude considered by far the most romantic wedding gift she received. The question of where to live was answered practically. They spent 3 nights of the week at the Broken G and 4 at Thatcher Creek, rotating on a schedule they both found satisfying in its efficiency, and that the ranch hands on both properties adapted to with varying degrees of commentary. Holt said nothing, which meant he approved. Thatcher's foreman, a laconic man named Drummond who had worked the ranch since the father's time, said only, "Good," and went back to work, which was his version of a standing ovation. The first year of their marriage was one of sustained and occasionally furious work. They were both ranchers at the full stretch of their capacity: spring calving, summer grazing management, the ongoing negotiation with the railroad company over maintenance of the spur access roads, another association meeting season in which Gertrude proposed and passed a resolution requiring formal documentation of any water rights challenges before they could be brought to the association floor, which would have been very useful a year earlier and would be useful now, and which Vernon Aldrich voted against on principle and lost on again. They argued twice that year about significant things and many times about small things, and resolved all of it, imperfectly but genuinely, in the way that 2 stubborn, clear-eyed people who love each other tend to resolve things, by talking until they understood each other even when they did not agree, and by trusting that understanding was more important than winning. They also built something that neither of them had language for yet, a particular texture of daily life that was made up of 10,000 small things, the way he made coffee in the morning and left hers on the warming plate without asking, the way she always checked the weather before he did and told him what was coming in a particular tone that meant she had already calculated the implications, the way they could ride in silence for an hour and have it feel like conversation, the way he still looked at her sometimes with an expression she had first seen at the Dusty Creek Saloon, back in June of 1882, when she had answered Vernon Aldrich's objections one by one, and he had looked at her from 2 seats away with that careful, assessing look that she had not been able to categorize. She had categorized it now. It was the look of someone recognizing something he had been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. She knew because she had the same look, she was fairly certain, when she looked at him. Holt had once told her, with the elaborate casualness of a man delivering a compliment with full deniability, that she seemed, and he used the word grudgingly, settled, which on Holt was equivalent to a sonnet. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the barn, which was where she told him most important things, because the barn was a working place and working places kept her honest. She had learned she was expecting 2 days before, from a doctor in Dusty Creek, and she had spent those 2 days carrying it privately, not to delay telling him, but to let herself feel it completely alone first, in the way she did everything, experiencing it in her own interior before letting anyone else into it. He was examining a calf when she came in. He looked up at her face and read something in it, the way he had learned to read her, and went very still. "Gertrude," he said. "We are having a child," she said. "The doctor says October." He stood up from the calf with the unhurried precision he applied to all significant movements, and he crossed the barn, and he took her face in his hands the same way he had in the snow outside this barn the day he asked her to marry him, and he looked at her for a very long moment. "Are you all right?" he said, first thing, before anything else. "I am entirely all right," she said. "I am." She felt the warmth moving through her chest again, the same way it had moved in the June afternoon at the ranchers' meeting when he had first looked at her with honesty. "I am happy," she said. "I am very happy. That is still somewhat unfamiliar to me, and I am working on accepting it." He kissed her forehead. Then he pulled her in against his chest and held her there in the barn with the calf making occasional observations behind them, and she let herself be held, which was also something she was still learning, and it felt like the most solid thing she had ever stood in. "A child," he said quietly into her hair. "A boy, I think," she said, "though I acknowledge that is not a prediction with strong statistical backing." He made a sound that was a laugh, low and warm. Their son was born in October of 1884, on a Tuesday morning when the aspens were gold on the ridge above the Thatcher place, which was where Gertrude had insisted on delivering, because the Thatcher ranch house was larger, and the doctor's route there was better in autumn mud. She was in labor for 11 hours, which she described afterward as the most demanding physical project she had ever undertaken, which, given that she had spent years managing cattle drives and fence building in Wyoming winters, was not a casual assessment. The boy came into the world at 6 in the morning with a full head of dark hair and the disposition of someone who had opinions about his circumstances and intended to make them known. Tobias sat with her through the whole of the night, which she had told him was unnecessary and which she was deeply, privately glad he had done. When the doctor put the boy in her arms and she looked at the small, indignant, entirely new face, she felt something open in her that she had not known was closed, not the door by an inch of June 1882, but something much larger, something that had no architectural metaphor at all, just an enormous and wordless warmth. They named him James Esther Thatcher James for Gertrude's father, who had thought her too bold and died before he saw that boldness become an asset, and Esther for Tobias's mother, who would have liked her and known exactly why. Holt came to see the baby 3 days after the birth, held him with the practiced ease of a man who had seen a great deal of livestock and found infants smaller than expected but structurally similar in their requirements, declared him satisfactory, and left. Drummond sent a note saying the same thing in fewer words. The association meeting that December was the first one Gertrude had missed since June 1882. She attended the March meeting with James in a basket under the table, which scandalized Vernon Aldrich and amused everyone else, and she cast her vote on the spring water table resolution without consulting anyone about it. James Esther Thatcher grew in the way of Western children, fast, practical, and with an early and thorough education in the realities of cattle, weather, and hard work. By the time he was 3, he could name every horse on both ranches. By 5, he sat a saddle with the natural ease he had apparently inherited from both parents. He also had his mother's habit of reading everything he could find, which meant the Thatcher ranch house bookshelf expanded considerably over the years, and his father's quality of stillness and attention, which meant that when he was in a room, people tended to feel that he understood more than his age suggested he should. The Broken G and Thatcher Creek ran as separate entities with interlinked management, which was how Gertrude had always intended it. She kept her name on the Broken G deed and her seat at the association table, and her correspondence with the Cheyenne legal office, which had evolved over the years from a crisis resource into something more like a professional relationship, with mutual respect on both sides. The lawyer, a man named Pemberton, had told her once that she had a natural instinct for territorial law that he wished he could bottle and sell, and she had thanked him precisely, and filed the compliment in the category of useful information rather than flattery. Tobias expanded Thatcher Creek's cattle operation in the years that followed their marriage, adding a breeding program that produced a stronger winter-hardy strain, and his reputation in the basin grew to the point where ranchers from as far as 50 miles away rode in to look at his bull stock. He was not, by nature, a man who sought this kind of attention, but he accepted it with the same quiet steadiness he applied to everything. He was better with people than he appeared from a distance, Gertrude had discovered. The reserve was not coldness, it was selectivity. He had simply always been careful about who he opened the gate for, and having decided to open it for her, he had done so entirely, which was, she thought, the right way to do it. In 1887, a second child arrived, a daughter, born in the spring with her mother's auburn hair and her father's gray-green eyes, and an expression in those eyes from very early on that suggested she was forming views and would share them when she was ready. They named her Clara Me Thatcher. She slept through her first association meeting at 4 months old, which Gertrude considered an excellent beginning. James was 3 when Clara was born, and he received her with the measured gravity of someone who has been consulted about a decision and is prepared to support it. He patted her head with enormous care, looked at his parents and said, "She is very small," which was true and which appeared to satisfy him. The years moved through the basin in their Wyoming way, hard and beautiful and demanding and generous in rough sequence, never quite the same year twice, always requiring something new of the people who had decided to stay in them. There were hard winters and dry summers and the ongoing work of a territorial ranching life, which was not glamorous and not easy and was, Gertrude thought on many occasions, exactly what she was built for. She and Tobias attended every association meeting together, which became unremarkable after the first several times and was eventually simply expected. The Thatchers, people said, by which they meant the Broken G's owner and Thatcher Creek's owner who happened to be married, which was still novel enough to be noted but no longer novel enough to be alarming. Vernon Aldrich, aging and slightly less red-faced, had reached a working peace with Gertrude's presence that stopped just short of actual respect, which was the best she expected and more than she required. The Eastern Syndicate made no further significant moves in the Powder River Basin. The water rights framework that Gertrude had helped establish became, over time, part of the standard operating structure of the association, referenced in subsequent negotiations, and eventually incorporated into proposed territorial water law. A fact that Pemberton, the Cheyenne lawyer, noted in a letter with what was for him considerable excitement, pointing out that the language of the original 1882 resolution bore a strong resemblance to the relevant section of the proposed statute. Gertrude read that letter at her kitchen table at the Broken G, which she still occupied 2 or 3 nights a week out of what had become both habit and principle, and felt something that she had no tidy name for. Not pride exactly, though there was some of that. Something more like recognition of the distance between June 1882 and this particular November morning, of everything that had been built, in the law and in the land and in the life. Tobias came in while she was still reading it, stamped snow off his boots at the door, poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "Good news," he said. He could always tell by how she held a letter. "Pemberton says the water rights language I drafted in 1882 has been incorporated into proposed territorial statute," she said. He looked at her, the particular look, still the same all these years later. "Of course it has," he said. "You do not seem surprised," she said. "I am not," he said. "I knew in June of 1882 that you were going to leave a mark on this territory." "You did not know me in June of 1882, she said. "You had known me approximately 4 hours. "It was enough," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the man she had known now for 5 years, who had the same silver at his temples and the same scar above his eyebrow and a new line or two around his eyes from 5 more years of Wyoming weather, and who was looking at her with the same unhurried, thorough attention he had brought to everything since the beginning. "Tobias," she said. "Gertrude," he said. "I am glad I walked into that meeting," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day since." James appeared in the doorway with mud on his boots and the look of someone who has been running and is only slightly apologetic about it. Behind him, at smaller scale, was Clara, equally muddy, holding a rock she appeared to feel strongly about. "Papa," James said, "Drummond says the south fence needs mending before the next storm. He says it would be faster with 2 people." "He is right," Tobias said. He looked at Gertrude, and she saw the thing she loved most about his face, which was the way it held all of it at once, the practical and the warm and the attentive, without one ever crowding out the others. "Mama," said Clara, "this rock has silver in it." Gertrude looked at the rock. It did, in fact, have a metallic glint in one edge. "Where did you find it?" "By the creek," Clara said, with the authority of someone who has thought this through. "There might be more." "There might be," Gertrude said. "We should look." Tobias stood up, took his coffee cup to the basin, rinsed it with the efficiency of a man who knows he is about to go out into the cold. He passed her chair and paused, and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Just briefly, just a moment. The kind of touch that is not demonstrating anything because it does not need to. The kind that is simply what a hand does when it is near the person it has spent years reaching for. She put her own hand over his for 1 second. James was already putting his coat back on. Clara was examining the rock with scientific intensity. The coffee was warm in its pot. Outside the window, the Powder River basin lay under a skin of early snow, vast and cold and beautiful and entirely demanding of the people who had chosen to love it and stay in it. They went out into it together, which was, Gertrude Dawson Thatcher thought, the only way she had ever found of going anywhere worth going. The winter of 1887 settled over the basin with its customary lack of sentimentality, and the Broken G and Thatcher Creek both came through it as they had come through the winters before, not without difficulty, but with full herds and sound buildings, and the particular satisfaction of having planned well enough. James turned 3 in October and Clara turned 6 months in April, and by the following spring both properties were expanding, Gertrude having purchased an adjacent 40 acres to the Broken G's eastern boundary, the deed filed in her name without comment from anyone, because by 1888 the Powder River Basin had absorbed the idea of Gertrude Dawson Thatcher as a property owner, with the same resigned acceptance that it had absorbed everything else she had decided to do. She ran for the secretary position of the association in the spring of 1889, mostly because Holloway retired to Colorado and someone needed to do it, and no one who was willing could do it as well as she could, which was a formulation she had arrived at through unsentimental calculation rather than vanity. She ran against a man named Macready who was pleasant but disorganized. She won by 11 votes to 3. Vernon Aldrich voted for Macready. She noted this without surprise and without particular offense. He was consistent, which was a quality she could respect even in opposition. As association secretary, she reorganized the membership records, rewrote the meeting bylaws for clarity, and established a formal process for handling water rights disputes that drew substantially on the precedent set by the 1882 resolution and subsequent developments. Pemberton in Cheyenne wrote her a letter when he heard about it, noting that she was essentially building territorial water law from the ground up in one county at a time, which was true, and which she thought was a fine project for a woman who had started with 40 Wyoming acres and a deed in her own name. Tobias attended the association meetings beside her now in the unassuming way he did most things: present, attentive, capable of saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment when it was needed, but content to let her lead when she was the one who knew the ground. She had learned that about him over the years. He did not need to be the most prominent person in a room. He needed to be useful, and he was, consistently and without fanfare. Clara developed her mother's interest in the legal and practical workings of things, and her father's patience in working through them. By the time she was 2, she was accompanying Gertrude to the ranch office with the air of someone on an important errand, picking up documents she could not yet read, and studying them with complete seriousness. James had taken to the cattle work with wholehearted competence, following Drummond around Thatcher Creek with the same systematic absorption he applied to everything. They were, Gertrude thought on a warm September evening in 1889, as she sat on the porch of the Broken G watching Tobias teach James to adjust a saddle, while Clara sat on the fence rail offering opinions neither of them had requested. A very specific kind of family, practical and stubborn and deeply particular, built on the same principles she had used to build everything else. Clear documentation, fair dealing, and the willingness to fight for what was right even when the room full of men would rather you did not. She had been told, at various points in the preceding years, that she was remarkable. She had accepted this without much comment, because she did not think she was remarkable. She thought she had simply refused to be ordinary in the specific ways that people had tried to require of her, which was not the same thing. Anyone could do it. Most people simply did not. The evening light on the Powder River Basin was the gold of late summer turning, the kind of light that makes everything look like it has been preserved rather than merely seen. The aspens on the ridge had started to turn. Patience, old and steady in her paddock, moved along the fence line with the unhurried dignity of a horse who has earned her rest and knows it. James got the saddle right on the third adjustment and looked up at his father with the expression of someone who has understood something that was worth understanding. Tobias said something to him that Gertrude could not hear from the porch, and James nodded with a gravity that was entirely his father's and entirely his own at the same time. Clara offered a further opinion from the fence rail. Both of them looked at her and then at each other. Tobias turned and found Gertrude on the porch, the way he tended to turn and find her without any particular reason to look, except that he always seemed to know where she was. He walked over, stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her. "All right," he said. She looked at the basin and the light and the aspens turning and the old roan mare in the paddock and her son at the saddle and her daughter on the fence rail, and this man at the bottom of her porch steps who had ridden 10 miles with a water agreement in the summer of 1882 and changed everything. "Better than all right," she said. He came up the steps and sat beside her, and they watched the evening come in together. And it was the same quiet they had always had between them, not empty quiet, but the full kind, the kind that is made of everything that has already been said and everything that does not need saying. James called something from the yard. Clara responded from the fence rail. The September sun moved behind the ridge and the basin went blue and cool and then gold again at the edges where it caught the last light. Gertrude Dawson Thatcher sat on her porch in Wyoming in the year 1889, and she was exactly where she had decided to be, and the decision had cost her considerable effort and considerable courage, and had given her back, in return, everything that mattered. She had walked into a room where she was not expected, and she had taken what she came for, and she had built something from the taking that was larger and warmer and more lasting than the practical purpose that had brought her through the door. The stars began to come out over the Powder River Basin, one by one and then all at once, the way they always did, without ceremony, without announcement, simply arriving in the darkening sky and staying, steady and enormous and indifferent to everything below them except that they continued to light the way home. Which was, she thought, enough. Which was, in fact, exactly enough.